So today I'm going to mostly talk about a project I'm currently involved in, which is downscaling climate data in Vermont to run other models, part of a large project on coupled human natural systems. But before I do that, Lou had asked me to talk a little bit about our backgrounds, and so I want to start off with just a little bit about my career path. So I started as an undergrad at Cornell University. I was originally a physics major, but my advisor said there weren't too many jobs in physics, so you should maybe consider engineering. I did that, and that worked out really well. You can see I worked as an engineer for a year before deciding I didn't like engineering. So then I just kind of tried out different things for a year or two, ended up at a local university, the University of Central Florida, where I ended up at a master's program in ecology. I enjoyed that quite a bit, so I decided to go on and get a PhD in ecology, and I worked with Jim Clark at Duke University, and while I was there, I ended up with a master's degree in Bayesian statistics. So then after leaving Duke, I went and did a postdoc at LSU with Bill Platt, who was a fire ecologist, and so that's where my fire work essentially started. And then received a postdoctoral fellowship in bioinformatics and a Mellon Foundation grant, and then I came here to UT to work with Lou as my advisor in the Institute for Environmental Modeling. And then after being here for, I don't know, probably about 2 years, I ended up getting a job at the University of Vermont, where I was an assistant, an associate, and now full professor. Never thought I'd be in Vermont that long, but I am still in Vermont. Okay, so my interests, I generally say my interests are in complex systems, and the reason is because my interests are fairly broad, and it's easier to just say complex systems than to describe the different components. So I'm really interested in the dynamics and structure of ecological systems, particularly savannas and forests and how they transition. This is how interest in fire is included in my work. So like here's a figure from a current paper we're about to submit. And this is a global distribution of tree cover. So each of these points is MODIS data across the globe. And then we were able to back out some fire statistics, fire frequency. And so we're looking at things like alternative stable states and how that corresponds to different fire, moisture, and fire frequency. And so that's just a figure describing or representing my interest in more traditional ecological problems. I'm also interested in coupled human and natural systems. Right now, I have Lou and I have a working group that's co-sponsored by NIMBioS and also CSync in Maryland. And we're trying to integrate human belief, human psychology, social processes with regards to risks associated with climate change and how we can integrate those into traditional Earth system models. So a lot of these integrated assessment models include some human components like economics and economic losses, but very rarely do they start to incorporate things like beliefs and perception of risk and how that spreads as a social process. And so we have a working group that we're developing some simple conceptual and simple models of these processes. And then I'm also just interested in complex systems theory. This is a paper Lou and Stuart Kaufman and I published a number of years ago. And it's looking at computational irreducibility or predictability in systems. Are systems predictable? And so like our point of this paper was even if you have a simple cellular automata model and you have a set of known rules, so these are rules for if you have these cells in step T, this is the resultant T time T plus 1. And then if you have a known set of initial conditions, and your task is to predict what the state of the system will be some time forward. So this is these cellular automata move sequentially in time this way. They update Can you predict the future state of the system, even if you know precisely the initial conditions, you know precisely the set of rules that drive the evolution of that system? And the answer is no. Sometimes there's just no way of predicting the dynamics of a system, no matter how much information you have. It's just an inherent property of some systems. So today I'm going to talk about a more applied problem I'm working on at Vermont. And this is climate change downscaling. And this is the basin we're interested in. This is Burlington, where UVM is. This is a border with New York. And this is a mountain chain here, the Green Mountains. And then Canada is up here someplace. And our basin of interest is approximately something like that. And this is part of a large NSF supported project, $20 million, which you'd be surprised how little support you can get off of, if you're a scientist, even on a large grant like this. But it's a large collaborative project, and it's organized around a small set of research teams. And I ended up becoming the climate downscaling team leader. And so I'm going to talk about some of that work here. Okay, so we refer to this project as RAC, for Research on Adaptation and Climate Change. And here is the high-level question. How does climate change interact with land use, hydrology, ecology, and social processes to influence Lake Champlain aquatic systems? And we have, so there's a climate component, there's a social modeling component, there's governance model component, there's land use component, which includes some ecological models, and then there's a lake systems component. And all these components link together, and climate drives directly the hydrology, and it also drives to a large degree the social governance models. And we're interested in questions like this. Under climate change scenarios, under different governance scenarios, what's the frequency of these algae blooms in Lake Champlain? You don't want to go swimming in the lake when it's like this, and so this is of great concern to the EPA as well as to the state of Vermont, because tourism is important and source for our drinking water, and just for a lot of reasons, just aesthetics if nothing else, and the ecology of the lake. So we're interested in how to mitigate against this, and how to, particularly as climate changes in the region. So the objective of the climate downscaling team is to produce high-resolution climate change projections for the basin to then drive these other systems of models. So I'm going to start off with giving a little background on observed climate change, and then talk about climate change projections and GCMs, and then how we downscale them. You probably all know this, but I'll talk about it anyway. So over the past 2 millennia, greenhouse gases, here's some of the important ones: carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, have increased markedly, particularly at the onset of the Industrial Revolution. And here you can see this figure. CO2 was still below 400 parts per million. We're now above that. I'll show you in a second. So that was over the last 2 millennia. This is over the last century, essentially, late 1950s. And this is from Mauna Loa, and then the black line is from somewhere in the southern hemisphere. Any idea why the two curves have different shapes? The red is all wiggly and the black is less so. Right, exactly. So in the northern hemisphere, we have a lot more land area. And so in the growing season, the trees suck out lots of CO2, and then in the fall and winter, it aspires back into the atmosphere, so you get this like cyclical cycle. In the southern hemisphere, you don't have as much land area, so it's not as pronounced a signal. Why is the red and black lines, why are they different? There's a little bit of an offset. The red line's a little bit higher than the black line. Want to know why that's the case? What's that? Yes, exactly. So there's much more emissions in the northern hemisphere, and we like to assume that the CO2 is a well-mixed gas, and it is like within a hemisphere, but there's a bit of a delay as it moves from the northern hemisphere into the southern hemisphere. So that's why the black line usually lags behind. Okay, here you can see, this is at the same time as CO2 is increasing, CO2 content in the ocean is increasing. It's actually a big sink of CO2, but it also has this effect of increasing acidity, which has a whole slew of other ecological effects. So I mentioned 400 parts per million as a threshold. Here's a slide from the New York Times. Even though it's the New York Times, we still can probably believe this. In May 10th, 2013, where we passed 400 ppm in CO2. This is Mauna Loa. Okay, so at the same time that we've been seeing these increases in greenhouse gases, there has been a trend of increasing temperature globally. So this is an annual average over from 1850 to 2000, and we can see that there's a lot of noise. Things go up and down. Sometimes things level off. Sometimes you have periods of rapid change. Sometimes things level off again, and there's just a lot of noise. So there's a lot of other things that matter in global temperature besides carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases. But there is this fairly rapid increase in global temperature, and here are just decadal averages showing the same thing. Here's a spatial average of surface temperature from 1901 to 2012. Same thing. You can see lots of red, lots of increasing areas with increasing temperature. Some areas a little bit cooler. This is associated with the global ocean conveyor belt. But generally, we see a spatial pattern of increasing temperature. In Vermont, somewhere around here, you see that there's also increasing temperature. And precipitation, similar kind of patterns. Precipitation is much harder to get right. But you can see generally lots of areas with increasing precipitation in the blues, and then also areas with declining precipitation in the browns. What is driving greenhouse or global warming? And this is a slide from the IPCC, latest one, where it's showing the relative forcing. And when you talk about the relative forcing of the climate system, we generally talk about watts per meter squared. And so the scale here is like -1 to +3 watts per meter squared in forcing. To give some context of scale, the number of watts per meter squared coming in a circular cross-section of the Earth is around like 1,370 watts per meter squared. If you take that and you spread it across the whole surface of the Earth, then it's around 360 watts per meter squared. So that's the amount of energy coming into the Earth system. More context, the human being generally has about 100 watts. We consume about 100 watts for us to function. And then you see that the scale of the forcing is on the order of like 2 watts. So 2 watts per meter squared relative to 1370 coming in, 370 spatially average. So that gives you an idea of the context, the strength of the driver. CO2 is here the strongest driver. There are also negative drivers, things that work to cool the Earth, particularly aerosols. And then when you sort of add all these influences together, then you come up with the overall anthropogenic forcing factor, which here is about a little over 2 watts. Okay, so forcing is how we are pushing the climate system. Either we're pushing it into a warmer state or a cooler state. So we're kind of putting in gases that change the energy balance, and then that plays out into how the weather and climate we see across the globe.
So does it represent how these different elements are influencing the overall average?
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. So what you do is you take some forcing factor and you put it into a big GCM and you let that crank, and then it tells you how much a particular grid cell is going to warm by the end of the century or whenever. Okay, so that was observed climate change. Let's talk about future climate change. So in the more recent IPCC reports, they've changed the way we do future projections of climate change. We used to have things that were called storylines, and they're called like A1B or A2. Now we use things that are called RCPs, representative concentration pathways, RCPs. And you see they have their number like RCP 8.5, RCP 6.0, 4.5. Those numbers, the 8.0 and the 4.5, represent the forcing in watts per meter squared. So it goes back to the forcing we saw in the previous slide. And so, we just make, and these are the forcings, and then these are the associated parts per million in the atmosphere of CO2 equivalents. So we just kind of translate all the methane and other greenhouse gases into CO2 and just call them equivalents. And so, things could warm a lot by the end of the century. They could warm less so. And this is kind of the range of uncertainty. And then different GCMs. You run different GCMs under the same forcing, like say 8.0, RCP 8.0. And the different GCMs behave differently. And so you'll get different ranges of warming depending on the GCM. And so you'll see that here. I had an interesting discussion with some climate modelers a few years ago when I was saying how impressed I was with GCMs, because this is 42 GCMs, this is 39 and 32 different GCMs. And I was saying how impressed I was with how well these GCMs simulated historic climate change. I mean, look how tight these envelopes are, and very impressive. And they said, well, don't be so impressed, because you see generally after you go to the future, they start to diverge. And they're saying that they're very highly tuned to capture historic climate change. It's kind of like in statistics, overfitting. They're kind of overfitted for the observed data, and so then their projections going in the future are not as good as you would expect. Same with stocks. Past performance is not an indicator of future performance. That whole thing. But anyway, even with that range of uncertainty with the different GCMs, which is fairly broad, but still, we're expecting a fair amount of and continued increasing temperatures. This is associated with the RCP 2.6 and 8.5. So we want to try to minimize the amount of forcing to minimize impacts on the climate. So let's talk a little bit about GCMs. GCMs are what take these RCPs and translate them into temperatures in the future. So it's worth looking at those briefly. Okay, so GCMs, global climate models, or general circulation models, whichever your preference is, they solve the primitive equations, the basic physics of the flow of moisture and heat to simulate fluid flow in the atmosphere across the Earth. And they could be strictly atmospheric, where they just assume some fixed boundary layer of the ocean. The ocean has some temperature and some flux of moisture and heat, and is static. Or they can be coupled, or purely oceanic, or coupled with the atmosphere and oceanic GCM. So they both interact and feed back to each other, which is really important. Really important to get that right. So these fully coupled ones are the core of most full climate models, starting to incorporate many more terrestrial ecological processes into them as well, which is also really important. But they have global spatial coverage, but they contain significant inaccuracies. And the inaccuracies increase as you look at a finer and finer spatial area. So overall, on average, you can say they do pretty good at, say, getting the global average temperature. But if you're interested in the temperature in Vermont, then there could be a lot of errors. And the reason why is because they're predicting these mass atmospheric patterns, so like jet stream where it bends down and where it goes up higher on the different seasons. And so if they get wrong just a little bit, then one region can be really off, whereas the overall global average can still be okay. Okay, and they're pretty coarse. So this is what the U.S. looks like. You can see the blockiness, which correspond to different cells of a GCM. But here I'll just reiterate this point that they do They break up the atmosphere into layers, and they break up space, both in the y direction, and the x direction, and in the z direction, little cubes of the Earth, where they model the flux and flow of energy and heat from these different in these different cells. Now, usually the cells are on the order of hundreds of kilometers on a side. So they do a really bad job of like resolving clouds and particular storms. And it turns out that clouds are really important to getting climate right. And so this is a big problem. And so what they do is they parameterize the processes that occur at the subspatial scale of the model. This is part of the tuning of the models. But we're really rapidly moving in a direction of shrinking the size of these boxes to improve climate change projections. But right now, they're still pretty coarse, and they don't resolve a lot of important processes. Okay, so if you're interested in doing an impact study on a particular region, you need to move from a coarse scale representation of climate like this to something that's much finer. And so there's a number of ways of doing that, statistically downscaling, and there's also called dynamical downscaling, which uses a regional climate model. That is a better way to do it. As much process as you can put into it is much better than just a purely statistical approach, but it's also a lot more work and more technically challenging, and still not perfect. We're not going to talk about a dynamical downscaling today. We're just going to talk about statistical downscaling. And so in a statistical downscaling, you want to bias correct the GCM data. What that means is a GCM might always say that Tennessee or Knoxville is 2 degrees warmer than it actually is. It could get the fluctuations right, but it's always off by, say, 2 degrees. And then you just do a correction to bring it, subtract 2 degrees from it, and then it's right on. That's a very simple bias correction, but that gets the idea across. You can also bias correct the entire distribution of temperatures or preset. And then you want to interpolate it down to a much finer spatial resolution. And ideally, you don't want to do it just a simple interpolation, because then you're not adding any information. You're just interpolating. This point is 10, and this is 12, and in between it's 11. You're not adding information. Ideally, you want to add information as you downscale. So our challenge was to go from an area like this. These are rough cells of a GCM, and so Vermont maybe has parts of 3 GCM cells. And so if you go to this cell right here, and it says on someday in 2056, April 8th in 2056, the temperature in this cell is going to be, I don't know, 9 degrees Celsius, or some value. And that applies to everything in that cell. And it might say 3 millimeters of rain applies everything to that cell. Well, we know there's a lot of variation driven by topography, and so we want to account for that. And so we used 2 steps in our downscaling process. The first step was the easy one. We just borrowed another downscaled product that a group took these GCM cells and they downscaled to 12 kilometers using a technique which they call, which we refer to as BCCA, bias correction, using constructed analogs. There's really 2 parts. What they do is they do a bias correction part here where they just adjust the CDFs to match a gridded data set in a national gridded data set. I think they used Maurer data, actually. And so that corrects for the bias, but it doesn't really add information. It just stretches and shrinks the probability distribution of temperature or precipitation. The step that adds information is this constructed analog part. And what they do here is they look at weather patterns across the U.S., fine-scale weather patterns, and then they correlate them. They map them to large GCM patterns, so patterns in the GCM. And then they use that mapping to infer much finer resolution weather patterns. So that's the constructed analog part. And so and they do that on a daily basis for this entire century. And so we decided to use that product. so that we didn't have to downscale from the full 250 kilometers to our target. Our target is 0.8 kilometers. The hydrologists in our group wanted 30 meters, and we said that's a little bit much. We'll go down to 800 meters. And so even over our study region, this is the 12-kilometer product. This is this is precipitation, and it's still pretty coarse. And this is Lake Champlain. So this is a representation of Lake Champlain, which is, you can see there's a lake there. And you notice that there's nothing there. That's because the GCMs that these are based on, they don't represent bodies of water that are below their spatial scale, just like they can't capture cloud dynamics. So they don't produce anything here. It's masked out, and so that's just one of the challenges we have. And so we want to go down from this 12-kilometer scale to 30 arc seconds, which is roughly 0.8 kilometers in our region. So here's our overall workflow. Is we start off with the GCMs, hundreds of kilometers. We use this intermediately downscaled product, BCCA. And then we take that as our starting point, and then we do a fine downscaling to approximately 0.8 kilometers. I should point out there's a lot of different products for intermediately downscaled downscaling. If you want to use something else, there's a lot of them. We chose BCCA for a variety of reasons. Okay, so then some of the questions we have, we want to address with this downscaling, aside from just providing data to run these other models, are questions like, what's the fine-grained regional response, precip and temperature? What are the uncertainties? Our largest uncertainties from different GCMs, different RCPs, different downscaling methods. And so those are kind of the broad questions. And so we have three components to this process. Because we're academics and we don't want to spend like 3 years producing one paper, we try to break it up into steps where we can like do something first, publish a paper on it, and then do something harder and then publish a paper on that. And so our first step was to just project regional changes using the intermediately downscaled product directly and using this delta method, which I'll talk about shortly. And then the next stage was to actually produce downscale data sets. And then the third is to dynamically downscale, which we are moving there now, but I have nothing really to say about it in this talk. So first I'm going to talk about, projections of regional climate change. Everything I'm going to show is based on a paper that just came out last year, Applied Meteorology and Climatology. It was done by this PhD student, Justin Gilbert, and then there's some climatologists from NASA and some other folks on here. And what we want to do was just look at temperature change, precipitation change, and then calculate some derived metrics that are important for agriculture, important for industry in Vermont. So we wanted to add some value to these projections. And so the delta method is very simple. This is why we did it. You just basically take a future projection, you subtract out the historic projection, and you get a delta factor. It's just a difference for temperature, and it's a ratio for precipitation. And you do it in each of those 12-kilometer cells over your study area, and then it tells you the likely magnitude of change you're going to experience, your region is going to experience, and then you can just add it back on to some gridded data product. We used Prism here. So why do we do this? Well, it's easy, straightforward, computationally inexpensive, and it also automatically corrects for any additional bias in the data that remains after the bias correction that's already been applied. There's some cons too. You don't get changes in variation very well. So we want to do this. We want to have a variety of sources of uncertainty. And so we use two different RCPs. And then we could have used a bunch of different GCMs, but there's a lot of different GCMs, and we want just to bracket the range. So we picked a GCM that was hottest for our region, that was coldest for our region, that was wettest for our region, and driest. So we can kind of bracket the range of what we expect. And then we just took all of these different BCCA cells, And we calculate the difference of these two future periods. Subtracted the historic period. And for both of these different RCPs and for these different GCMs. And then we just looked at some of the results. And I'll just show you a few figures from this paper. Okay, so this is projected temperature increase. There's a lot of information in this figure. The blue is for the mid-century. Red is for later century. The different circles are for, they all represent different GCMs. And then if they're filled, they're RCP 8.5. If they're empty, they're RCP 4.5. And then down here at the end is the average across the year. And we also wanted to look at changes in extremes, and so we looked at the 95th quantile and how that changed. But just some basic patterns you can see that. Later in the century, things are hotter. The red's generally higher than the blue. There's strong seasonal effects. So our winter is warming a lot faster than our summer. And I won't complain about that. And then there's a lot of variation. There's a lot of variation across GCM. So for March, this particular GCM says we're going to get 10 degrees Celsius warming. All right, that's a lot. 10 degrees Celsius is a lot of warming. This one down here says, well, maybe like, I don't know, 3. And so that's a broad range of uncertainty when you're giving this to policymakers. Like, well, it might warm a lot, it might not warm that much. But this is real uncertainty in these projections. This is for precipitation, and precipitation is much harder to model than temperature. Temperature is relatively easy, and you can see that here. In precipitation, we get a lot more range. So you're talking to some policy person that has to decide on what the state's going to do. You can say, well, it might get like, I don't know, 15% wetter, or it might get like 20% drier. And so they ask you your confidence. Well, it could either get wetter or drier or stay the same. That's what your $20 million just paid for. I'm being a little facetious, but it is kind of funny. And then we also look at quantiles here. But overall, we see precipitation is likely to increase. There is some chance that precipitation will decline, particularly in different seasons. And so the one thing we did, we wanted to add some values. So we calculated a precipitation balance. It's a simple precipitation to potential evapotranspiration. And because precipitation is probably increasing, but temperature is increasing much faster, then that affects your moisture balance. And so somewhat surprisingly for Vermont, because Vermont, everyone thinks this is going to get wetter, we do get increased summer drought under some of these scenarios. Sometimes significant water shortages in the summer in Vermont. And so this was an unexpected result because everyone in Vermont thinks it's just going to get wetter and warmer. But we could start seeing increased summer drought, which could be significant for agriculture. And here is number of hot days. So right now in Vermont, we get less than approximately like 3 days over 90 a year. So it's not very warm in the summer. But we expect really large increases by mid-century and by later century, where we could be getting as many as 20 days over 90. And so that's a big problem because no one has air conditioning. What's that? 10 minutes. We started late, didn't we? Okay. I will speed this along then. And so then here we get snowfall decreases. Okay, and changing growing season, greatly lengthening growing season, and then this is maple production and changes in maple production. Okay, so then we wanted to actually statistically downscale these data to a fine resolution, and we wanted to add information. And so what we did was we're going to add information by taking advantage of topography and lapse rates, which is how temperature and precipitation change with elevation. So first we have to identify a lapse rate. And so we use a lapse rate to adjust T and P, and then we interpolate to our final spatial resolution of interest. And then we repeat this for a large ensemble of GCMs. The process looks something like this. We go from a 12-kilometer grid, we overlay a fine DEM, and then we We adjust the T and P for elevation. And so somewhat naively, when we're doing this, we ask questions like, well, does the lapse rate change over time? Does it change, or is it constant within years, across times? And unfortunately, it turns out lapse rates vary seasonally quite strongly. So this is season here. This is the lapse rate, and they bounce around. And then are they stationary over time? Well, you see over historic periods, the lapse rates bounce around a lot over time as well as over season. So it makes applying a single lapse rate difficult. If you need a future lapse rate, you need to calculate it from your future projections. So one question is, do the lapse rates calculated from our projections, the BCCA, match station lapse rates? The station lapse rates are in black. Calculated lapse rates from two different GCMs are red and blue. Don't match very well. So this is a problem because our lapse rates are non-stationary in time. They vary in season. They're not consistent between our our projected climate and our observed. And also, I don't show this, but they're non-stationary in space. So I happened to be invited to a meeting at the National Center for Atmospheric Research on downscaling around this time, and I was talking to some of the experts on downscaling. It was a global conference, and they said, "Oh, we don't worry about any of this. We don't even really look at this. This is interesting." And so we really had gone much further than most downscalers went, and so we just decided to fit a lapse rate for temperature that accounts for latitude and elevation, and then a nonlinear lapse rate for precipitation that we got from this paper, fit it using maximum likelihood, and then the fits look something like this. This is, even across our small geographic area, latitude matters, and then here's our lapse rate. We have one really high point station. We kept that out of the fitting, in and out, to see how sensitive our results were, and it's actually remarkably insensitive to that one point. We have to choose on a method of interpolation, and so here are three we considered. We're going to implement inverse distance weighting. Has a lot of blockiness, bilinear, less so, kriging, much smoother. So these are different ways of interpolation that then could influence your hydrology models. And then finally, we're going to use an ensemble approach. This is really, you have to do because GCMs are so variable. And so we're using a CMINT5, a set of ensembles to really get as broad a range of GCMs as possible, because there's a lot of variation across GCMs in particular regions if you're trying to do downscaling. So our workflow looks something like this. Start off with the course data. We apply lapse rate to get to a baseline. Then we apply our interpolation, and then we bring it back up to our target elevation. It turns out that this is computationally very expensive. It takes about 600 CPU hours to do one ensemble. And so we had to go and use a supercomputer. We apply for hours at the NCAR Yellowstone supercomputing facility. And then we had to take our R code and we had to adapt it to run parallel on the supercomputer. That was a lot of work. It took us about 2 months to get this working, but now it works. And then also the code there's a lot of R code, and so this becomes very important. We move from one person analyzing your own data to this big project where lots of people are dependent. You have to start thinking about quality assurance, quality control. We learned this the hard way. This is Yellowstone. I believe it's like the fastest supercomputer in the U.S. at this time. I'm not sure. So that's the methods. Here are some results. Almost done. Okay, so here's what we get. So this is our initially coarse product, precipitation, temperature, and we see a much nicer product now, with a lot finer scale resolution that we then can feed into, for instance, a hydrology model. This is for 1 day. It's on a daily time step. So for every day in this century, under a whole set of ensembles, we'll predict in each of these grid cells temperature in max temperature, min temperature, and precip. How well do we do? So we want to evaluate the data. Looked at a few stations. So this is the original BCCA product for a Burlington airport. Average temperature over this whole period, 7.45 degrees Celsius. And stations at 7.37. After our interpolation adjustment, we're at 7.36. So it did pretty well, at least on an average for this particular station. For temperature, precipitation, similar. BCC 2.38. Target of the station 2.49. Our method gets it to 2.43. So it's an improvement. Still not great, but precip is really hard to get. Here is Mount Mansfield, one of our highest stations. Here are the station observations up here. Here is a Maurer gridded data set. Here is our intermediately downscaled product. Here is after pure interpolation, and here is after our interpolation and lapse rate adjustment. And you can see that we, for min temperature and max temperature, what we end up with down here is much closer to the station observations than any of these intermediate steps. So we're doing okay. We're adding some value. But how much value? Well, it turns out that when we start looking at on a station-by-station basis, we had an interesting pattern of when we're adding value. And it turns out that for a lot of the low elevation stations, with not a whole lot of lapse rate adjustment, we're not really adding any value. Each of these are 3 different measures of skill, okay? And in this measure, increasing skill means you're above the axis, and in these 2, it means you're below the axis. And so many of these are scattered right around 0. So it means some stations we're improving, some we're taking away, we're degrading. But as you go to higher elevations, our improvement is much more dramatic. And this shows it. Begins to get at the reason why. And it turns out that here is it's a signal to noise ratio. When you're looking at your intermediately downscaled product, it can overestimate or underestimate a particular station. And so if you're adjusting for a lapse rate, you're just as likely to improve it as to move further away from your target when there's a low delta elevation or there's a low bias. As your bias increases, which means that the product you're working with is more wrong, then you add more value. That's why out here, as bias increases, we're much further below the axis, which means we're adding value. Or when the circles are bigger, the circles represent a delta elevation between the coarse grid cell and the station you're targeting. And as that increases, you also add value. And so when you're right around a couple hundred meters of elevation, delta elevation, or a bias, which around a 1 here in our scale, you start seeing improvement, higher skill. So it's worth doing this. If you're down here, then there's no need to do it. Simple interpolation will be just fine. And this is from a paper we just submitted. This paper right here. Just submitted that last week, showing the different biases and when you're makes sense to do this kind of downscaling. And then these are recent papers that all came from this work, and so they're mostly in meteorological, climatological journals. There are some that are in like geophysical research letters. And this is part of a team, and so we have Jonathan Winter. He was at NASA GISS. He's now at Dartmouth. Radley Horton, NASA GISS. These are 2 of our outside climate experts to make sure we're doing this sensible. Graduate student that did the first paper, grad student in engineering, postdoc, and then that's me. Okay.